I love telling this story. I will tell people, I'll show them the book. I'm like, hey, yeah, there's this book, Children of Ararat, and Rose Wilder Lane wrote it with Doc. Do you know who Rose Wilder Lane is? And they all, no, who is that? I'm like, her mother. And they're like, what? Why would I know her mother? Like Laura Ingalls Wilder. I mean, I had someone choke on soup once at lunch when I told this story.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is a story about 4 women, 2 books, and a literary mystery. The women are Rose Wilder Lane, Dr. Mabel Elliott, Rose Wilder Lane's scholar Sallie Ketcham, and the person who solved the mystery, historian and author Ginger Pedersen. The books are Unbreakable Healer, Ginger's biography of Dr. Elliott, and The Children of Ararat, a book about Armenia written by Dr. Elliott in 1923. Or was she the book's author? That's what Ginger Pedersen ended up asking herself when she discovered something that had never before been brought to light. It seems that Dr. Elliott's book had used a ghostwriter, at least in part, and that ghostwriter was none other than Rose Wilder Lane. Today, we have Sallie Ketcham and Ginger Pedersen in the Land of Laura studio to tell you about solving this literary mystery. Thank you so much to Sallie and Ginger for being here today on the Land of Laura podcast. So, Ginger, for listeners, why don't we start by you telling us who Mabel Elliott was?
So Mabel Elliott has an interesting backstory. She came from a family of 14 children, and her family was from England, but her parents had met in India. And they married there. Her father was a British soldier, and the whole family came to United States, specifically coming to Florida in 1883 when Elliott was 2. Then she came down to the area that I live, to West Palm Beach, Florida, as a teenager when she was 13 in 1894, where her father was the chairman of the committee that founded the town. Then she headed off and she lived with an older sister in Albany because there was no high school here at all. So she had to go to high school somewhere. So she headed off to a private Episcopal girls' high school in Albany. Then the 2 of them, the oldest sister, who was 32 at the time, and Mabel, decided to go to med school together, graduating from Rush Medical College in 1904. Then Elliott goes into private practice in Michigan until she decides she wants to go overseas and wants to actually serve in World War I, but she cannot because the Army does not accept women doctors. So she joins an organization called American Women's Hospitals, and she's selected for the group to serve after World War I, when they had kind of focused their work in the Near East in helping with the aftermath of the Armenian genocide, which left thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of orphans and mothers whose husbands had been killed in that horrific event from 1914 to 1919. So that's how Elliott came to the Near East. She served for a year. She came back to America and then inexplicably goes back after having horrendous experiences. But she wasn't done, and she ended up serving there for 4 years, came back to America, and then she got another gig overseas and served 16 years in Japan as the only American woman doctor working there at the time in Japan. Came back in 1941 and did semi-retirement. She worked in New York during World War II for the Episcopal Church, and then she worked part-time in private practice here in Florida. And that's kind of her story.
So it's Dr. Elliott's second stay in Europe where she crosses paths with Rose Wilder Lane. Sallie, tell me how you first made Ginger's acquaintance.
I first made Ginger's acquaintance by snail mail. I don't receive a lot of letters in the mail anymore. And I went up to the mailbox one day and there was a letter in my box from Florida. And I thought, well, that's odd. So I took it in and I opened it up. Her first sentence in the letter was, I think you'll find this letter and the information here very intriguing. And this letter told me that Ginger was researching Dr. Mabel Elliott, and I knew her name, but not much else. And that Mabel Elliott had been a doctor with the American Women's Hospitals and affiliated also loosely with the Near East Relief during the end of the Armenian genocide, which, of course, Rose Wilder Lane had covered for the Near East Relief. And in this letter that Ginger sent me, she said, I have seen some very strange coincidences between the columns that you quoted in an article that I had written about Rose Wilder Lane and the Armenian genocide, and passages in Mabel Elliott's book, which was called Beginning Again at Ararat. And I'm going to let Ginger explain the whole significance of that. But to say I was intrigued by this was a massive understatement, because every bell and whistle and dinger as a researcher went off in my mind. And I looked at this and I thought, there is some strange, unacknowledged, unrecognized tie between these two women and their writing.
Typically, when I reach out to someone, I don't like to just do it by email, because there's just so much going on with email weirdness. So I thought, no, I'm going to do it on snail mail. I had kind of figured that someone else had helped Dr. Elliott with the book Beginning Again at Ararat. That was pretty clear. I just had no idea who it was. And that really wasn't the purpose of my query to the book company Revell, who's now owned by Baker Publishing. I really wanted to just know when Dr. Elliott had signed the contract to the book, to try to figure out the timeline a little bit better. And they wrote back initially, I'm sorry, we don't have anything, it's out of print, So I reached out to an author, Anne Bile, who had written the Revell history. And I emailed her and she said, "Oh, I know who has all the contracts at Revell. They definitely have them. And hopefully they have this one." And this all went down in basically a day. So she got back to me and it was like 4:00 and she says, "You're not going to believe who the co-author or the proprietor, as they said on the contract, is." And I read it and I was like, Rose Wilder Lane, even though I don't consider myself like a mega fan or anything like that, I knew who Rose Wilder Lane was because I had gifted a friend the year before the Prairie Fires book. So, you gift someone a book, you kind of have to look through it a little bit. So I had. So I was quite familiar with this story and I was like, oh my. So then I told a friend who is a mega fan, and she's actually the one who sent me Sallie's story because she's a librarian and she had access and she quickly found that. And I start reading that intro where you had quoted. I was like, this is the beginning. It's the first chapter that was actually an article that Rose had kind of recycled in a way from the magazine Asia. And it was a report that she had written. It was a little bit different, but I was like, no, this is basically the same thing with some rewrites that Rose had used. So I was like, oh my. And that was the biggest clear evidence.
And just to clarify for listeners, because there's a lot of information here, the article that your friend sent you was the one that Sallie had written back in 2020 for South Dakota History magazine about the Armenian genocide and Rose Wilder Lane's role in reporting it.
Correct. Yes. And so in that article, she had quotes from the Asia article that Rose had written. And when I read them the first time, I was on my chair because it's like, this is the first chapter of Beginning Again at Ararat. So I was like, this absolutely proved then that she had collaborated on the book, but to the extent of which then became part of the mystery to unravel what was Rose's role, what was Dr. Elliott's role. Because I knew Dr. Elliott, I had already read at that point many of her letters. I had read her siege diary, which she kept in Marash, where she was held under siege for 3 weeks. It's a 15,000 word work. It's not tiny. So I could compare and say, okay, these chapters and these stories of when she, like, for example, she examined the harem girls, which were women who had been held captive by the Turks. And I had her original report from her papers that I got from her family. And so I could match up the stories, but the writing and how they were presented in the book was quite different. And that, to me, I knew had a literary hand. I thought, well, maybe it's just the publisher knowing that Elliott was not an author. Like, I wanted to be like Star Trek, where she's like, damn it, I'm a doctor, not an author, kind of a Dr. McCoy line. And I think that's really what she was. But she was a good writer, but not a novelist, and not of that level that Rose had. And Rose's, once I read it and I read other works of Rose, I could then definitely see the literary style and the choice of words. On the banks of, this is my copy here. On the banks of appears 50 times in this book.
That phrase?
Yeah, that phrase, on the banks of. In different contexts, it's all over. And I love this, the use of Big Demon River. I swear I'm going to write a book called Big Demon River, because it's actually not even the name of the place, but she kind of made it into this mythic place. So in that way, it was so interesting to me because it opened up a new world to me of Rose Wilder Lane and her works and how underappreciated she is. And then, of course, you get into the streams of the role that she played in her mother's career, which I think is strikingly similar to the way that she worked with Elliott. I had Rose's diaries from the National Archive from the Hoover Library, and so I could document the dates, at least when Rose mentioned it, that they worked together. And it was about 5 months in Athens, Greece. She was at the Hotel Bricagne. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Rose was with Peggy Marquis, and she would document when Peggy was off with this little group that had kind of formed with a man named, I love this, Frank America, who was actually a captain in the army. So he was literally Captain America. I think there was some interest there with Rose. I think there was some interest there with Elliott. So he was kind of everybody's big brother kind of figure in their lives. And I know that he actually loaned money to Rose at one point as she was getting low on funds as she's trying to make her way back to Missouri. So I think it was like $750, which was not chump change in those days.
Wow.
So Rose was working for Near East Relief, which was the very large organization involved with relief efforts for all of the refugees. And Elliott was kind of co-working for Near East Relief and American Women's Hospital. So she kind of had two bosses. And I'm not sure of the exact details of how the two were teamed up. But they approached Elliott about writing a memoir of her 4 years overseas. And she agreed, much to the consternation of her boss, Dr. Esther Lovejoy, and her other organization. So there was a definite tug. They used her letters and excerpts from them in fundraising efforts. There was a quote from her boss, Dr. Lovejoy, who said, "Your one quote about the children in Yerevan struggling in the snow raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for both of our organizations." So this was where how they used her letter. Somebody even wrote a dissertation about using these really heart-wrenching photographs and quotes to raise money as a form of exploitation of those victims. But, it was different times 100 years ago.
Sallie, you mentioned in your article for South Dakota History magazine that Laura, well before Rose was involved, was already writing about the Armenian genocide, if they maybe didn't call it that at that point, in her ruralist columns.
It was in 1918, which is 2 years before Rose even leaves for Europe. And in a column in the Ruralist, which usually is dedicated to, obviously rural issues, Laura and her chickens, land management, water rights, all this type of stuff. She goes on a departure in 1918, and she talks about a woman's war and why is Armenia so striking to her. And she talks about, they don't really use the word rape in that era. It's just not a word they use, but they will say outrage or violation. And she talks about the women that she's read about who have been raped and, as she says, thrown into rivers or thrown into streams. It's clearly disturbed her a great deal, but she doesn't have a pre-existing connection to this through Rose or through anyone. This is something that clearly she felt strongly about, strongly enough that she wanted to discuss it in her Ruralist column. And that did surprise me at the time, because it's not something that typically you would see her writing about at all. Oh, and I guess, yeah, you're right. In terms of genocide, that term wasn't coined until really about World War II. And they tended to call it race extermination, but it's so traumatic to people who are seeing these photos, as Ginger said, or are reading these firsthand accounts of the survivors, that they don't know what to call it, right? And it really is sort of the precursor that is going to happen for the next, 20, 30 years throughout the early 20th century.
So it's not that often that we see a new Laura Ingalls Wilder related mystery at least show up, never mind be solved. What was that like for both of you?
Well, I'll just say, because really it is Ginger's work, but I knew when I got the letter that this had to be the missing book. I knew everyone who has written about Rose, William Holtz, so many people have said, what happened to her Armenia book? She called it I actually think it's a little better title, but she called it Children of Ararat. And she was working on it. She talked about it in some of her diary notes. When she came back to Rocky Ridge, she said, well, I have the Armenian book. And at one point, she was even planning, as she mentioned in letters to her old editor, Fremont Older, that she wanted to go back to Soviet Armenia or Soviet Georgia. And this was after she had come home. So I thought, this is a lot of investment in Armenia. Why is she not doing it? And turns out the book was there all along. It just took Ginger to figure it out.
Yeah, it's not something that I had ever planned, and it actually posed complications for me in my research and how I was going to present this and literally break the news to her family. And I could tell there was some not happy faces in a sense. I mean, you could kind of read people and know that this was disappointing to them in some way. So I tried to tell them it's really not disappointing to me, because to me it gives her book even more reverence and more stature in the historical kind of take on it than it does just if she had written it. This wasn't just an ordinary person writing it. I love telling this story. I will tell people, I'll show them the book. I'm like, hey, yeah, there's this book, Children of Ararat, and Rose Wilder Lane wrote it with Doc. Do you know who Rose Wilder Lane is? And they all, no, who is that? I'm like, you know her mother. And they're like, what? Why would I know her mother? Like Laura Ingalls Wilder. I mean, I had someone choke on soup once at lunch when I told this story. It just makes it so interesting because of the ties. And then that more people don't know about Rose Wilder Lane, I don't get, because she's such an incredible, and there's a lot of her beginning of thoughts about libertarianism I definitely saw when I knew about it, and you can read it through that filter. You definitely see her early awakenings when she saw what life was like in Soviet Armenia. It wasn't a dream place, and she knew that communism was not going to be the answer to what she thought in her early years when she kind of dabbled in that a bit. So that to me was fascinating as well. And I don't know how the Laura world, if that's a way to say it, I don't know if that's correct, looks at this book. I mean, I definitely, at least from my Facebook interactions, there are some very strong opinions about Rose and her role in Laura's life and her parents' life. And, I try to always remind them very well, without Rose, there is no Little House. That is a plain fact. I don't care if she never wrote one word. Having a literary agent and getting a book at age 65 is unusual today, but in the 30s, I think that was highly unusual. I'm glad, Rose knew the potential there and knew her mother's stories, but Rose gave them not only editing, but also their needed audience in getting those books published.
So, Ginger, tell me your background and what led to working on this book.
Well, I tell people this book hijacked me in many ways. I had already started writing this fun little middle grade mystery novel, at least doing some of the plot work on it. And I'm humming along, and something grabbed me one day and said, I know about that Elliott story I read about in 2018. Let me look up a couple of newspaper articles. And I did. And then a friend told me, oh, the Florida Women's Hall of Fame nomination is just in a few days. And I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I could submit something. So I worked like the whole day on it, and I got it submitted in time. By the end of that day, I was absolutely hooked. I put the other book aside and I said, I've got to work on this. And I had to follow the leads. The biggest one at that time was not anything to do with Rose. It was with her personal correspondence, which in her next to last interview, she had done for a newspaper. She said, my family has all my letters. And I broke my rule that time. I actually texted the person, cold text, who lives about 30 miles from me. And I said, oh, is this, do you know this person? And she said, well, that's my aunt. And I said, would you be willing to do a phone call, so you could kind of build some credibility? And she's like, yeah. I said, well, did you actually know her personally? She said, not only did I know her, she delivered me and my twin sister. So I was like, wow, that's really keeping it in the family. She said, my nephew has all of the letters, and they're going to be sent here from Michigan. Well, then we start this literally 6-month dance between, she would say, oh, the letters will be here. My sister and I are going through them. And then I wouldn't hear for another month and da, da, da. So finally she let me see them, and I photographed them all. at least what she allowed me to see, which I knew wasn't everything, but I thought, as long as it's taken, I'm not going to be like mean now. So I got a lot. I mean, it was a ton to go through. And when I dropped off books for her, I said, you really had second thoughts, didn't you? She's like, oh, I committed so quickly. But she said, I like the way the book turned out. So that made me feel good because they're an interesting family. At Christmas, I did a Christmas market. I don't know if I told you this, Sallie. At Dr. Elliott's church, they had their first ever Christmas market. So I set up a table and had the books, and I had 2 pictures of her on easels. And this man just stands in front of my booth staring at her picture, a very tall man. And I was like, oh my God, what's his problem? So then he says to me, I know her. That's my great aunt. He was a young man when he knew her, maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, but he remembered her quite well and said, well, yeah, we would visit her every week in the nursing home and so on. So it was much later in her years. And she has a window there in the church. And he told me, he said, she is my guardian angel. He said, 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. And every week I prayed in front of that window. He said, I'm still alive. He said, I was told to get my affairs in order, that maybe I had a year or 2 and that was it. And he said, it's 30 years ago and I'm still here. So I was like, oh my. So he was the grandson of her youngest sister.
I'm guessing the 2 of you probably picked up on this, but Rose and Mabel Elliott are very close in age. I believe Dr. Elliott was born in 1881. Rose was born in 1886. And they both died in 1968, just a few months apart.
I think it's so interesting because it's a long lifespan. When Rose died, she was on her way back to cover the Vietnam War for Women's Day, right? And yet, I don't think either of them, if you look at their lives, they lived, well, Rose was definitely a flapper. Mabel was far more, I think, she was steely as hell, but she's far more conventional or more decorous, right? But it is interesting that they lived through both first wave and second wave feminism, right? And they might not have claimed the term, but they have remarkably parallel lives in some ways, and just completely outside the box thinking and career paths. It is very interesting, and the commonality in their birth times too.
It is, and it was just such a fascinating time for women. So Elliot absolutely hits the interwar years 100% perfect with the nexus of her career. I mean, she had her early work in Michigan, but chose such a different lifestyle than her mother had. And so did Rose. Not that they didn't value, and I know Dr. Elliott was very close with her mother, but it's not the lifestyle they wanted. And it was a unique time for women that for the first time, women independently, unmarried, could go off to places like Rose did all throughout Europe and like Mabel did going to the Near East. I mean, that was just unheard of. And almost, I would think, easier to do then than it is now in some ways, because you were on such unknown territory that people didn't dare judge you. We're almost, I feel, moving backwards now. We're supposed to be back in the kitchen again and barefoot and pregnant when you listen to certain things. It's just amazing to me that they had the courage to do what they did at the time.
And I think just for Laura listeners too, who are really interested in Laura, I see a lot of commonalities between Rose and Laura that sometimes people I don't think acknowledge, but who I really think Rose resembles in many ways is her grandfather, Charles. She has his wanderlust. She has his intellect. She has his curiosity. She has a lot of his recklessness. And she just adds this huge bohemian streak that is going to carry her through her whole life and career. But I actually think she's a lot more like her grandfather in some ways.
Do you think she realized that?
I think she did. I think she writes so sympathetically about him all the time. I think Laura loved her father too, you can tell in the books, but I think some of that, Charles not shooting the deer, is it in Little House in the Big Woods? Where he goes out to shoot the deer. Yeah, and he can't shoot the deer. He sees her standing by the creek and she lifts her head and she's just too lovely. He can't do it. And they're hungry. They need to have dinner, but he's not going to do it because it's not fair. And she's just sitting there being beautiful. Rose is incredibly tenderhearted. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying you need somebody with Rose's artistry to make it palpable for the reader. I think she's very much like him. It's just there are little touches like that of Rose. So I think it's probably Rose. I can't prove it, but I think it is.
And now in this moment, you have me thinking, I would like to go west, Pa saying that. And I wonder if that just came straight from Rose, too.
Yeah, that makes you wonder.
Mabel was very much, I think, identified with her father and wanted that same overseas service, because I'm sure as children growing up, they heard all kinds of stories of his service in India. He was there for a long time, and it wasn't, a 6-month gig and he was home again. He was there, I believe, for about 15 years. And the same way the mother came to India when she was 5, and then she was there until she was almost in her late 20s anyway. So they both had that way. And then her father, when he's in Florida, it's not good enough either. He takes off for Mexico and runs a hotel and warehouse in Mexico. And you're like, who goes to Mexico? But he did. He was always looking for the greener pastures in that way. So, but I think she wanted that excitement that foreign service brings, and to be immersed like she was in another culture. I mean, to go to, the Near East and then the Far East in a time when Japan was so not what it is today is quite amazing. So you really have to take your hat off to both of them, and the influence that Rose had growing up on the farms and in the country and wanting to see more is really a sign of, I mean, I just find her absolutely brilliant, number one, a genius, number two. The way she could learn languages, she could, get out 60,000 words like it's no one's business. It's like, I do not have that level of talent. I often called out to Rose. I was like, Rose, I need you here. Come help me. Give me an inspiration. Give me something. So fascinating woman.
Yeah, she said she wanted to learn 6. She thought she could be fluent in 6 languages. I mean, most people know the story that when she went to Crawley to Louisiana for high school, she herself had, like Mabel Elliott, had to go to high school somewhere else. So she's in Louisiana for high school, and she learned the 3-year Latin course in less than a year. I belong to a generation that still studied Latin. It's just inconceivable to me that she could do that. So yeah, I mean, it's a real tribute to her facility with language.
And delivered her valedictory speech.
Yes.
In Latin.
Incredible.
So how did the two of you work together?
Well, I served as a beta reader for Unbreakable Healer, which is the title of Ginger's biography of Mabel Elliott. And then I also wrote the foreword when Ginger re-edited Children of Ararat. I wrote the foreword for that, just basis a lot of the information I know about Rose in Armenia. But for the most part, it's the biography of Mabel is all Ginger's work, and so is this new release of Children of Ararat, which is, I think it's much more accessible. And there's a lot of annotations, so you can kind of figure out what Rose's role in this was as you read it through.
And Ginger, for this edition, you made just a few changes. You made sure it had the title that Mabel had originally wanted in that book. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the title from the contract that Revell had, but I also made a contact, believe it or not, the brand agency is still in business as well, and they went digging in their archives and found like a 4x6 note card for the book, which surprised even them. And again, it was Children of Ararat. So I wanted to restore its title. The text is different from the 1924 version to the 2025 version. I took out the British spellings, which confused me why they were there in the first place. I corrected a lot of the place name spellings, which were phonetic ones with the actual names. I added footnotes because a lot of the towns have changed names under Turkish rule. So I gave their present day names so someone could locate them on a map. And then, of course, Sallie's great forward to the book, and I wrote an introduction to Mabel, and then we included the original introductions and forewords from the people of the era. And then I added an index, which the book never had, which I think makes it easier to find certain subjects within it. So other than that, I didn't change any of the text from the original 1924 book.
Just a small editorial note. The Brandt agency that Ginger refers to here is the literary agency today known as Brandt and Hochman that was originated by Carl Brandt and his wife, Zelma. Carl Brandt was Rose Wilder Lane's agent in the 1920s before she switched to George By in 1931. Now back to the episode. In what stage of the process of writing Unbreakable Healer did this all come out?
It was early, so I had started researching in May of 2024, and I made this discovery in July. So at that point, nothing had been written, and I was still awaiting the letters from the family. I had all the correspondence from Drexel University, which was Dr. Elliott's professional correspondence. It was, that alone was, I believe, about 150 letters to go through. And her letters were like 4,000 words each. These were not like, okay, I'm doing fine, let me hear from you. No, they were very, very detailed accounts of what she was going through there in the Near East.
Sounds like another similarity to Rose.
Yeah, I like Dr. Elliott's writing style. It's very much in the moment. You're there with her.
I don't think this will ever be entirely known, but why isn't Rose credited on the book? You can call her a ghostwriter, you can call her collaborator. It's why. And I think there are some background reasons. One, she got in a world of hurt for ghostwriting between like 1915 and about 1920 when she left for Europe. And I think she was leery of that. She did a ghost-written biography of Charlie Chaplin. She did one of Henry Ford. She did one of Herbert Hoover, all of which got they got a lot of backlash. She got the backlash. And Jack London. There were quite a few episodes. In fact, at one point she said, this type of writing is called ghostwriting, and no writer of my reputation does it. And that's also, I think, was also part of the consideration. But then, as is detailed in Unbreakable Healer, it became such a political hot potato between the Near East Relief, the American Women's Hospitals, but really a clash of, as well as Ginger can tell you, it does in the book, it was a real clash of personalities between Mabel Elliott and her immediate supervisor. So it's just, there were many reasons, but however it worked out, although you can read how much of her own material is being written into this book, it is Mabel's experience, but I think she just didn't want to touch that subject again, ghostwriting. She just didn't. But I'm glad it's back. I'm glad that you can read it now and you can read her Armenian experiences.
Yeah. If they had just put on there, with collaborator Rose Wilder Lane, there would have been no issue for anybody. Because then you can't figure out, like, well, did you write this page or that page? And Mabel even says Mrs. Lane in her foreword. I don't know why she decided just to say Mrs. Lane and not Rose Wilder Lane. There would have never been any mystery had she done that, which is interesting. I know they met after they had both come back to America, because there's an entry in Rose's diary that they met in New York in December of 1923. And that must have been an interesting meeting, what they both had to deal with, but it was difficult for Elliott. But she apparently never talked. I mean, the family, and now these are her great nieces and nephews, knew nothing about it. I'm certain her sisters knew, and her mother and her parents knew of the collaboration, but the name Rose Wilder Lane would not have meant much to people outside of who followed her, in her literary ways. Maybe it was somewhat familiar to them. I don't know what kind of publications they read, but her name is never in the local paper. There's never an entrant, unless when she died was the only time she's mentioned in the Palm Beach Post. So I don't know how much of readers they were in the Elliott family for what Rose wrote.
But the one
20s.
person,
you're going to say the one person Rose did tell was her mother?
The person I know who knows is Laura, because she gives a copy of that book just as it's hot off the press to her mother, and her mother reads it and mentions it in her column. So you know that when she came, she said, "Oh yeah, Mom, I wrote this one too." But it's otherwise, if I hadn't seen it, if you couldn't put it together in this puzzle, you wouldn't know. So.
In her column dated January 15th, 1924, in the Missouri Ruralist, under the heading As a Farm Woman Thinks, Laura begins her column saying, in her late book, Beginning Again at Ararat, Mabel E. Elliott, M.D., Near East relief worker, says that among the refugees in the tumble-down, crowded, filthy Turkish interior cities there, quote-unquote, appeared once more that magic of the American woman's homemaking ability, surprisingly revealed by the war and the peace. And she goes on, but she sure knew what her daughter did.
She did.
She did. And then in the Hoover Library, there's a whole file of book reviews for Beginning Again at Ararat. I mean, if that wasn't a big clue for people who actually, at the time before things were scanned, went through the physical files, why they're like, why did she have these book reviews for a book that she didn't work on? I mean, this was not something that these were paid clippings that she bought. So no, I was puzzled by that as well. But
I was too. I sat and read those too when I was sitting at the Hoover, and I thought, I just made a wrong assumption. I thought this is because she has written about Armenia for so long, and she did all the columns, and she's found a new book, and she's read this book, and she's interested in the reviews. It never crossed my mind that this was her lost book.
There's a 1927 book by Dr. Mabel Elliott's boss, Esther Lovejoy, who does mention Rose Wilder Lane and says, oh, yes, she was at the hotel where I was at in Greece, and she was writing a book about one of our doctors who's a heroic figure, but she doesn't mention Mabel. She just kind of says it in those couched words. So that was the only other clue. But again, with like William Holtz, when he wrote Rose's biography, was pretty much pre-internet. So he couldn't have that ability that we have today to go into and find all these references and all these millions of, if not, I don't know, billions perhaps of scanned books that we can instantly find in some obscure 1927 book, a reference to Rose Wilder Lane. How would he have ever found that? I'm certain that if he was writing that book today, people would figure it out. It was, that line in Holtz's book when he said, and nothing became of Rose's Armenia book. Bang, done. Well, maybe not.
You mentioned the personality clash between Dr. Elliott and her boss. How did that affect the book?
Well, they seem to have had a little bit of a sparring relationship before then, but generally it was very good because her boss was the fundraiser and Dr. Elliott was the conduit to raise funds with her letters. So there was generally a good relationship. They're very different personalities. Esther Lovejoy was much more about her as a person and what she had done. And she did some great things for women's suffrage. She ran for Congress. She did all kinds of things, but they were just different. And I think there was beginning to grow in Dr. Lovejoy a fear of Elliott and what she was accomplishing in a very different style. Everybody who interviewed her and the anecdotes I have from her family paint a picture that she was a gentle leader, what I would call a servant leader. It was not about her. It was about her people, and she would put her life on the line to save her staff more than once, not her own skin. And I think there was a definite clash, and I think Lovejoy could see the writing on the wall, like this woman's going to come back to America, and they're going to want her to head this organization. And she had a mole in the office in Athens, and the mole reported what she saw happening, that Dr. Elliott was meeting with Rose Wilder Lane. Even Lovejoy had met with Rose Wilder Lane on more than one occasion, and Lovejoy tried to literally steal photographs from her, which I think is incredible. And she's like, yeah, she tried to take off with Peggy's photos. It's like, who does that? And so then she had the cudgel to use against Elliott, and she used it. She used it to her board, and they basically forbid her from publishing the book. And when Elliott got that letter, she sent a cablegram saying, I resign. And she resigned on the spot. And that was it. The relationship was over. And then Near East hired her immediately. All the nurses quit in Athens from the American Women's Hospital, and they were all hired by Near East Relief immediately. So that set off a whole chain of political. It made the New York Times, this squabble. And Lovejoy's like, oh, there's no problem. And it's just a change in personnel and so on. Mm-hmm. So she had some explaining to do, but it's what happens. Politics is politics. And the fact that Esther Lovejoy stayed the head of American Women's Hospital until she was 97 years old is a testament to her iron grip on that organization.
So was the book never published then?
It was. So she quit. So see, and that was my question as to when she signed the book contract. So I thought, wow, if she had already signed the book contract and then quit after, but no, she actually never signed the book contract. Her signature appears nowhere on it. Rose signed it and Brandt signed it, but not Elliott. And Rose signed that contract in October of 1923. They had kind of, pseudo signed it for her. But then when she came back and she was back in the States, she went and physically signed that contract. And it's her signature. I mean, she's got a very unique hand and it's there. So that's really what I was trying to figure out when I saw that Elliott had resigned. And there was other things that they really just did not appreciate anybody who worked for that organization. And I think she was going to have been done anyway if she had not agreed to the book. I think she was ready to resign. So
when Ginger and I were working together, one of the things we agreed on right away, and it was so funny because we were laughing about it on the phone, and Ginger mentions it in the book too, but Rose Wilder Lane and Mabel Elliott, despite some sort of like superficial differences or whatever, do this one thing that is, they both run directly at danger. They go right at it. And it's something they have in common. It's like Ginger and I are joking about it. It's like they pull the fire alarm in a hotel. I'm like, let's get out the door. But that's not what Rose does. And it's never what Mabel did. She went into even more difficult situations than Rose. And it's from a woman's perspective at that time, it's just really interesting to me to see how and why they did it. And even with the burning of Smyrna, which was this just huge event, Mabel witnessed it and was there. Rose said, if I had been there, she wasn't very far away, but she said, I would have immediately turned tail and run directly at Smyrna. And it's like the whole seaport's blowing up. It's an incendiary bomb, right? But that's where she wants to be. So I just think that's such a fascinating aspect of both their personalities. And they shared it and they understood it in each other.
Yeah, Mabel was actually on vacation with her sister, her closest sister, Beatrice, who was not a brave person by Mabel's account. And she sails over, and they're having this lovely time in Naples, Italy, and they see the newspaper headline. And within 2 hours, they're on a train back to Athens. And then her poor sister gets to see firsthand her work over about a month or to 6 weeks, I think, period, that she spends there. So she sees firsthand, and Elliot just takes over and probably does her finest work in some ways of getting all these hospitals organized and staffed within hours and days of arriving on the scene in Smyrna. And you know who else covered that Smyrna event? It was Ernest Hemingway as a very young
that's
reporter.
Right. That's right.
And what happened there was very, a lot of people just don't know this entire town. It almost reminded me of what happened in Hawaii with Lahaina, where the people just huddled on the rocks on the waterfront. And that's what happened in Smyrna as well. I mean, now it's this lovely resort called Izmir, and very little evidence or even displays about what the terrible things that had happened there.
So where can people find Unbreakable Healer and Children of Ararat?
There are two places, actually. They're on Amazon, which is the easiest get, but you can also go to Ingram Spark and order the books through their retail storefront. So I know a lot of people who don't want to necessarily buy from Amazon, so I made them available through Ingram Spark as well. And they have a retail front that you can buy one copy or two copies or however many you want and order them. And also through Ingram, through their professional sales, that's where libraries and bookstores can buy at the standard discount. So with the demise of Baker and Taylor, I guess a lot of libraries now are switching to Ingram for their ordering. So the books are available there for wholesale.
Thank you to the both of you so much for being here. This has been incredibly enlightening.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been great to do this.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to really tell this little piece of history that, still things can still be discovered a century later. You just have to keep digging.
Ginger Pedersen has also recorded an explainer on this topic on her publisher's YouTube channel, calling this discovery, quote, the most stunning revelation I've ever had as a historian. I've included the address in the show notes. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Ginger and Sallie, who give so generously of their time and knowledge. I hope to see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup. And as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a little house world.